you're living your life, and then all of a sudden you're out there helping cops solve crimes.
ABC Tuesdays.
I have an IQ of 160. I spot things that detectives miss.
Fall's most anticipated drama is all new, High Potential.
That big brain of hers is going to help us close a lot of cases.
Caitlin Olsen is the new face of investigation.
You're a single mom pretending to be a cop.
I am not pretending. I'm just out here super copping.
High Potential. All new Tuesdays, 10/9 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. This series of episodes, A History of the Satanic Panic, began with the incredible story of Michelle Smith and her therapist and future husband, Dr. Lawrence Pazder. Through 14 months of intensive therapy, Michelle was able to unlock memories from her childhood that involved horrific, prolonged abuse at the hands of a centuries-old, devil-worshipping cult. They wrote a book about their experiences, Doctor and Patient, and titled it Michelle Remembers. The book became a national phenomenon and sparked a nagging fear among the population of America that something wasn't quite right. Sure enough, thousands of people began to remember similar experiences from their childhoods. Parents began asking their kids if they had ever been abused, whether at school, by family members, strangers in masks. And, sure enough, the new accusations started pouring in from across America. Both Smith and Dr. Pazder became experts on satanic ritual abuse and were hired for speaking engagements and consultations for state and local law enforcement on more than 1,000 new cases where Satanism was suspected. And, curiously, they always found satanic influences at play. Every time. They became rich, they were famous, people wanted to know more, and that's when Dr. Pazder got out over his skis a little bit. He stated officially that the Church of Satan was responsible for the ritual abuse of his now wife, Michelle Smith. The problem? Well, Michelle's abuse took place in the late 1950s, and the Church of Satan wasn't founded until 1969. So, yeah, the church's founder and author of the Satanic Bible, Anton LaVey, threatened to sue for libel, and Dr. Pazder withdrew his accusation and issued a formal apology. And that was the first domino to fall in what would be a decade-long reckoning that saw sins of many caught up in that tornado of fear and hysteria. And that was the first domino to fall in what would be a decade-long reckoning that saw the sins of many caught up in that tornado of fear and hysteria, snap judgments and overcorrections. Those sins were exposed. But would there be absolution? Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to Back to School, A History of the Satanic Panic, Part 6. So, I admit, I've been playing a little hide the ball with this last series of episodes, trying to impart how things unfolded more than 40 years ago and how easily so many incredible claims were accepted on little or often zero evidence. And with the book, Michelle Remembers, the backlash was almost immediate. But it was also almost completely ignored. In October of 1980, less than a year after the book was published, an article appeared that contained an exclusive interview with Michelle Smith's father, one of, according to Michelle, the main culprits in her abuse as a 5-year-old. Her father, a man named Jack Proby, was mostly concerned with protecting the memory of his late wife, Michelle's mother, who had died in 1964. But he also claimed to be able to refute with proof every allegation in the book. Also, Mr. Proby had some questions of his own. For example, Michelle had 2 sisters, one older and one younger. Why weren't they mentioned at all in her remembrances? Were they simply ignored by this bloodthirsty cult? And as a licensed therapist, Wasn't Dr. Pazder required to report such serious accusations to law enforcement? Why hadn't he? Shouldn't the police have been notified to at least attempt to identify additional victims and maybe even disrupt this centuries-old cult's latest activities? Also, along the lines of proof, Mr. Proby provided school attendance records that were vitally important for what they didn't show, and that is absences. There were no prolonged absences noted for Michelle Smith in her first grade year. Now, if what was written in the book were true, Michelle would have missed significant chunks of school, especially that 81-day continuous ceremony that Michelle claimed she was present for every day. There was also an alleged car accident mentioned in the book that was pivotal to Michelle being able to escape from the clutches of the cult. However, there was no official record of any such car accident recorded either by law enforcement, traffic enforcement, paramedics, or local newspapers. And ultimately, no one was ever able to find anyone from the time period who could corroborate a single detail from the book. And over the next 15 years, it would only get worse for Michelle Remembers. In 2002, an article was published that exposed the, quote, extreme unlikeliness of Michelle Smith's allegations, not the least of which was how a 5-year-old would ever be able to outwit an ancient organization that had been able to stay hidden for hundreds of years. Or that it was claimed that they operated openly in the Ross Bay Cemetery, a public space surrounded on all sides by crowded residential streets, and that during these rituals, Michelle remembers herself and others screaming at the top of their lungs. Yet no one ever reported any disturbances in the cemetery. Or that an 81-day non-stop satanic ritual could go off unnoticed, a ceremony involving hundreds of people in one large room, quote, in the city. Also, not a single alleged abuser of Michelle Smith has ever been identified other than her parents. Which is weird when you consider that Michelle claimed to perfectly remember dozens of participants cutting off their own middle fingers during one black mass. You'd think someone would be able to locate at least one of those people out and about. Nope. But here's the thing. In the years following the publication of the book, it was much easier to see what was going on. We just needed some distance, a little time to let the dust settle, and then things became pretty clear. A lot of the imagery from Michelle's so-called memories were pulled from popular media of the time, from movies like The Exorcist. And then Dr. Pazder started throwing in some stuff of his own. Many of the ritualistic practices that he was able to, quote, unlock from the labyrinth of fear and repressed memories that was Michelle's mind, they actually came from his own studies of tribal customs in West Africa, where he had studied for years. He repeated details of those events in a way that suggested to Michelle that they had in fact happened to her, and she was obviously in a state of mind where she could very easily be influenced, until eventually those stories became her memories. By the way, she was also very interested in making Dr. Pazder happy. There's a strong argument to be made that all of this was just a way to get the attention of a man that she'd fallen in love with. They were married to other people when their sessions began, but they would both eventually divorce their spouses and marry each other. And just how destructive was this charade? It was, kind of the foundation for the entire Satanic Panic. And we can follow the thread pretty easily. So let's give it a try. Thanks to the book Michelle Remembers, the terrifying idea of satanic ritual abuse of young children gets planted in the heads of millions of Americans, including more than a few who may be suffering from some type of mental disease or defect, maybe even a mental disease that manifests with paranoid delusions. The McMartin preschool saga began with one woman, making allegations against a man with no criminal history at a school that had served the community faithfully for generations. And based on what? Her son said sometimes it hurt when he pooped. Did she take him to a doctor? No. She called the police and instantly took it to a level that there was no coming back from. This teacher wasn't just abusing her son. He was doing it because he worshipped the devil. Oh, and he could fly. The hysteria had already taken root in law enforcement, and you can't really blame them. It was such an absurd idea to consider, so absurd that there was a chance maybe that they'd all missed it. So the country quickly entered an era of overcorrection. Believe the children, arrest the accused. For all the media attention, all the resources allocated to the investigation, all the careers made and careers ruined, lives ruined, reputations ruined, how many convictions do you think were won by the prosecution with regard to the McMartin preschool case? I'll help you out. 0. There were exactly 0 convictions stemming from the McMartin preschool satanic abuse scandal. The final charges were dropped in 1990. And as for that trial, it makes sense that there were never any convictions. When these 5-year-old kids took the stand, it was a disaster, as you would expect. They were all questioned in the same manner. Look at this series of photos and point to the person who hurt you or touched you or made you play naked movie star. One of the kids insisted that his abuser was a wrestler from the WWF. Another kid pointed to a photo of Chuck Norris. Oh, and that game, Naked Movie Star? It was a kid's rhyming game. You know, like, I'm rubber, you're glue. Whatever you say bounces off me and sticks onto you. This one was something like, I know what you are, you're a naked movie star. It was just a ball-busting 5-year-old kid game. But guess who was there, advising both the police and the prosecution? Dr. Pazder and Michelle Smith. And then the rest of these preschool cases, most notably the cluster of 6 in Kern County, California, that we covered in episode 2 of the series, all those arrests and convictions of adults whose sole accusers were their own children. People were thrown in jail as convicted satanic child abusers, and there was no physical evidence connecting them to any crime, no eyewitnesses, no nothing. But still, sentences that combined to total more than 1,000 years in jail were handed out. And guess what? Every one of them was eventually overturned for lack of evidence. It took more than a decade, but they were all cleared. And as you might expect, most, if not all, of the social workers, detectives, judges, and prosecutors had only recently completed training in satanic ritual abuse and were told exactly what to look for by Dr. Pazder. His book had even by then become the primary training manual for cases just like this. Then we get to the PMRC in the halls of Congress. Taking the 30,000-foot view, this attempt at censoring America's recording artists seems tame compared to the mass incarcerations and destroying of lives that was going on elsewhere in the name of protecting the children. And really, what did the PMRC accomplish? Yes, their reach was ultimately very wide, but cartoonishly shallow. You might even say it went no deeper than the thin layer of cellophane that the parental advisory sticker was attached to, that my CDs came wrapped in when I was in high school. We still listen to the music, and if anything, we were more attracted to those stickers because that's where the good stuff was. Gotta hand it to John Denver, the late great. He said it best. That which is denied becomes that which is most desired. The lyrics to those gangster rap songs that I love so much, and the 80s hair bands with their thinly veiled innuendos, or Prince's genius or Madonna's explosive sexuality, my generation survived. and had some great music to listen to while we were at it. Okay, yeah, as stated, I'm an admitted fan of Geraldo, so this next bit really gets me. But you can look at it from a positive point of view, that him possessing this level of professional humility is the reason Geraldo is still in the public eye, the reason he's still trusted. What am I talking about? I'm talking about one big mea culpa from the great Geraldo Rivera. But before we get to that, we need to understand what happened in our country for a person like Geraldo to realize the errors of his ways. And just like the Satanic Panic can be traced to Dr. Lawrence Pazder, the credit for its ultimate demise goes to one man, Special Agent Ken Lanning of the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit. Ken is a friend of the show. I interviewed him for Season 3 of The Devil Within to get his thoughts on the killing spree committed by David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who claimed to be acting on the orders of Satan. Back in the mid-'80s, Ken was assigned the fledgling and emergency unit that investigated satanic ritual abuse. It was a unit that was stood up very quickly in the hopes of stemming what was feared was a rising tide of Satanism, where the prime targets for criminality were children. So Ken got to work. And listen, as far as special investigative agents go in the annals of the FBI, there are few who are spoken of as highly as Ken Lanning. The agency, and seemingly the world, eagerly awaited Ken's report that took more than 7 years of exhaustive investigative work by a team of professionals, led by Ken. But Ken chased down every lead, talked to everyone he could find that would grant him an interview. He became a scholar on the occult and Satanism, listened to depictions of child abuse that haunted his dreams. And when finally, in 1992, Agent Lanning released his report on the presence of satanic ritual abuse in the United States, everyone held their breath and expected the worst. It's already too late and we're doomed. President Clinton is in league with the devil. Wherever your kids are right now, they're being assaulted by Satanists. Wait, Agent Lanning's actual conclusion? Not only was there no evidence of satanic ritual abuse currently being perpetrated, there never was any to begin with. Here are some of his great quotes from the report. Quote, "Hundreds of communities all over America are run by mayors, police departments, and community leaders who are practicing Satanists who regularly murder and eat people? Not likely." Agent Lanning found no evidence of an occult sacrifice ever happening in the U.S., despite tons of people thinking it was a common occurrence. But how did he explain that part of it? Why did all of us believe it to the point of creating laws to prevent something from happening that wasn't happening at all? Lanning offered a simple explanation for a complex problem. Basically, as humans, it's in our nature that if we don't understand something, it's easier for us to make it the work of a supernatural force. Also, Lanning explained that then, as now, the vast majority of child abuse and child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by people already within the child's life. His theory was that people found this reality too difficult or even impossible to accept, so instead, outlandish conspiracies were accepted as the real answer. He said, quote, "If your child's molestation was perpetrated by a sophisticated satanic cult, there was nothing you could have done to prevent it, and therefore no reason for you to feel any guilt at all." The conclusion was that the overwhelming majority of child testimonies regarding satanic ritual abuse stemmed from some combination of urban legend, child imagination, and overzealous interviewers who would push children toward desired answers during questioning. I loved interviewing Ken. He made some great points that I didn't include in the podcast because they were off topic, but he said things like, if a murderer leaves the mark of a pentagram, it makes it a satanic murder. If a murderer leaves a Bible behind, does that make it a Christian murder? Or, why are satanic crimes only confined to murder and sex abuse? Why aren't there any satanic bank robberies or satanic insurance fraud? Also, he told me never to trust the symbology. An upside-down cross is just a matter of perspective. Just 2 years later, Agent Lanning's findings were corroborated by a lengthy report released by the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. They conducted a comprehensive nationwide study, in part to refute Lanning's findings and in part to check his work. And they found that out of more than 12,000 reports of satanic ritual abuse, not a single instance could be substantiated with even a shred of hard evidence. So back to the Geraldo of it all. In 1995, in light of the sea change happening in real time with regard to the whirlwind that was the Satanic Panic, Geraldo made a public apology. He said, quote, "I want to announce publicly that as a firm believer of the Believe the Children movement of the 1980s that started with the McMartin preschool trials in California, I'm now convinced that I was terribly wrong, and many innocent people were convicted and went to prison as a result." And finally, Missouri House Bill 1370. When Kay Steinmetz stood on the floor of the General Assembly and related stories of children in St. Louis being abused by trusted adults dressed like the Easter Bunny, did anyone realize that she was echoing an identical story that was argued from the witness stand in Los Angeles years prior in the McMartin preschool case? It wasn't true in LA, and it wasn't true in St. Louis. In fact, as the Lanning report, along with the findings from the National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect, there was never a substantiated case that would even require the passage of something like House Bill 1370. In 2015, after a quarter century of being the law of the land in Missouri for no discernible reason, House Bill 1370 was amended to remove the, quote, ritual or ceremony language without comment. In 1996, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, Scott Harshbarger, one of the district attorneys who prosecuted high-profile satanic ritual abuse cases, announced that he would be making a public apology at the Massachusetts State House in Boston. An apology for the years of overzealous prosecution of alleged satanic abusers with little or no evidence. This event quickly became something of a pilgrimage for hundreds of victims who were arrested, convicted, and jailed, only to have their convictions overturned years later. Considering what they went through, this seems a pitifully small gesture. But talking to those who attended, it was the beginning of a healing process for wounds that should never have been inflicted in the first place. Thanks for listening to Back to School, a history of the Satanic Panic. I hope you enjoyed this mini-series. Next week, I'll get back to some good old-fashioned demonic possession stories as I prepare a full-fledged Season 4 for everyone. Announcement coming soon. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and now full episodes available on YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.